Imagine the relentless, unforgiving glare of the North African sun, baking the vast, desolate expanse of the Sahara into a crucible where only the strongest could hope to survive. The year is 1942, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Rommel, the Desert Fox, was on the move, his forces pushing relentlessly across the arid landscape, threatening to seize control of a crucial theatre of World War II. But against this formidable adversary and the brutal might of nature itself, a different kind of legend was being forged, one of ingenuity, resilience, and sheer, unadulterated American grit. This isn't just a tale of survival. It's a masterclass in battlefield improvisation and the indomitable spirit of the American soldier. We delve deep into the personal accounts, the rarely seen photographs, and the strategic implications of these remarkable adaptations. Some names mentioned in this narrative, particularly those of individual soldiers, may be fictionalized for storytelling purposes, but the incredible events and the spirit of their actions are based firmly on the historical facts of World War II. How did these desperate measures, born out of necessity, ultimately contribute to a pivotal victory? What ingenious methods did they devise to protect their feet from blistering sand and jagged rocks when their standard-issue boots failed? How did they transform their uniforms into functional desert gear, allowing them to endure conditions that would break lesser men? We'll explore the specific techniques, the surprising materials, and the sheer force of will that enabled these men to not only survive the Sahara, but to conquer it, paving the way for the Allied victory in North Africa. Their journey across the Sahara wasn't just a march. It was a race against time, against nature, and against Rommel himself. A race they won through sheer, unadulterated grit and battlefield brilliance. When American forces first arrived in North Africa, they were equipped for European battlefields, not the scorching, unforgiving Sahara. Their heavy wool uniforms, designed for temperate climates, quickly became suffocating ovens. Their standard leather boots, robust on paved roads and muddy fields, were utterly inadequate against the fine, abrasive sand that worked its way into every seam, the jagged rocks that tore through soles, and the extreme temperatures that cracked leather and blistered feet. The desert wasn't just an enemy. It was an environment designed to systematically dismantle men and their gear. Private Daniel "Danny" Miller, a young soldier from Ohio, vividly recalled the first week. It was like stepping onto another planet. The heat hit you like a physical blow, and the sand, it got everywhere. Our boots, fresh out of the crate, started falling apart in days. The soles would delaminate, stitching would fray. We were marching, sometimes 30 miles a day, and our feet were just getting shredded. This sentiment was echoed across the ranks. Commanders quickly realized that without fundamental changes to their equipment, their advance would halt before it even truly began. Rommel's Afrika Korps, seasoned by years in the desert, understood these conditions intimately. American soldiers had to learn, and learn fast. The most immediate and critical problem was footwear. Blistered, infected feet could sideline an entire platoon, rendering them useless in a campaign where mobility was paramount. Standard-issue socks, often cotton or thin wool, offered little protection and quickly became damp with sweat, leading to painful chafing and trench foot-like conditions. The primary challenge was the combination of intense heat from the sand, the constant abrasion, and the lack of proper ventilation. Soldiers began experimenting with anything they could find. Some tried stuffing their boots with extra layers of socks, only to find their feet sweating even more profusely, exacerbating the problem. Others attempted to wrap their feet in strips of canvas or even torn-up shirts before putting on their boots, hoping for an extra barrier against the relentless friction and heat. These early, often desperate improvisations were the first signs of the ingenuity that would define their campaign. The men knew they had to adapt or perish. The first attempts were crude, born of immediate necessity. Soldiers would often scavenge for anything that could offer a barrier. Strips of canvas from discarded tents, burlap sacks found in supply dumps, even pieces of torn uniform fabric were wrapped around their feet, sometimes directly under their socks, sometimes over them, before forcing them into their deteriorating boots. This offered some temporary relief from friction, but often exacerbated the heat issue, trapping sweat and moisture, leading to even more severe fungal infections and blisters. The desert, unforgiving and relentless, demanded more sophisticated solutions. It wasn't long before the ingenuity of necessity truly kicked in. Scavenging became an art form. Worn-out vehicle tires, discarded by both Allied and Axis forces, became an invaluable resource. Soldiers discovered that sections of tire rubber, robust and heat-resistant, could be cut and fashioned into makeshift outer soles. These were then crudely attached to the failing leather soles of their standard boots, using whatever was at hand, often wire, strong twine, or even melted tar from roads. This provided a crucial layer of protection against the scorching sand and the sharp, unforgiving rocks that littered their path. These tire-soled boots, though ungainly, offered a lifeline to men whose feet were otherwise being shredded by every mile. Beyond the soles, the very structure of the boots was a problem. Heavy leather offered no breathability. Some soldiers began carefully punching small holes into the sides of their boots, hoping to create ventilation. This was a risky gamble, as it could weaken the boot's integrity, but for many, the relief from suffocating heat was worth the risk. Others experimented with different lacing patterns, trying to create more airflow without compromising support. The issue of socks was equally critical. The standard issue varieties were simply not up to the task. Soldiers started doubling up on socks, but as Private Miller noted, this often made the problem worse. The more successful approach involved seeking out thicker, more absorbent materials, or even adapting captured German socks, which were sometimes made of a denser wool blend better suited for desert conditions. Some even tried lining their boots with soft, pliable pieces of sheepskin or camel hide, bartered from local populations or scavenged, creating a natural, breathable cushion against the harsh interior of their boots. While the battle for their feet raged, the struggle against the oppressive heat extended to every inch of their bodies. The standard wool uniform designed for the cooler climes of Europe became a veritable torture device in the Sahara. Imagine marching for hours under a sun that felt like a physical weight, clad in heavy, dark fabric that absorbed every ray of heat. Dehydration was rampant, heat stroke a constant threat, and the sheer physical toll was devastating. The men quickly realized their uniforms were not just uncomfortable, they were a hazard to their survival and combat effectiveness. Sergeant Thomas "Tommy" Jenkins, a veteran of the early North African landings, recounted the agonizing decision-making process. "We were told to maintain uniform standards, but common sense quickly overruled regulations. You couldn't fight if you were collapsing from heat exhaustion. The first thing to go was the jacket, then the sleeves. Then, well, things got creative. The immediate instinct was to shed layers, but the desert presented a paradox. Less clothing meant more exposure to the sun's blistering rays, leading to severe sunburn and to the abrasive sand that could irritate skin and cause painful rashes. A balance had to be struck between ventilation and protection. The transformation of their uniforms began with simple modifications. Sleeves were rolled up to the elbows, then often cut off entirely, turning long-sleeved shirts into short-sleeved ones. Trousers, initially heavy and restrictive, were often cut down to knee-length shorts, or the bottoms were rolled up and secured. This provided immediate relief from the suffocating heat, but it exposed skin to the relentless sun, leading to a new set of problems. Sunburns were debilitating, reducing men's effectiveness and causing agonizing pain. The fine, pervasive sand, whipped up by desert winds, would chafe exposed skin, leading to open sores and infections. The men needed protection, but in a lighter, more breathable form. This led to a new phase of clothing improvisation. Light-colored fabrics became highly prized. Any available material, bed sheets, canvas scraps, even parachute silk, was sought out. These were often fashioned into loose-fitting coverings, worn over or under their remaining uniform parts. Head coverings were perhaps the most crucial adaptation. The standard helmet, while offering protection from shrapnel, was a heat trap. Soldiers began to adopt variations of the shemagh, or keffiyeh, the traditional desert headscarf, often improvised from any available light fabric. These were wrapped around the head and neck, providing shade for the face and neck, and crucially, keeping sand out of their mouths and noses during sandstorms. Private Miller, recounting his experience, stated, "That scarf, it was more important than my rifle some days. Kept the sun off, kept the sand out. Without it, you were just cooked." The improvisation of head coverings went beyond simple scarves. Soldiers began to fashion wide-brimmed hats from canvas, sometimes reinforcing them with wire or stiffened fabric. These were often worn over a lighter scarf, providing a double layer of protection from the sun's direct assault. The goal was to create as much shade as possible for the face, neck and ears, while still allowing for airflow. Some even took to painting their helmets a lighter color or covering them with light-colored fabric to reflect rather than absorb the intense solar radiation. The ingenuity wasn't just about comfort, it was about preventing sunstroke, a condition that could incapacitate a soldier faster than any enemy bullet. Beyond the individual soldier, unit-level adaptations began to emerge. Supply lines, already stretched thin, couldn't provide purpose-built desert gear, so quartermasters and supply sergeants, often with the help of local artisans or captured materials, started to implement larger-scale modifications. Captured German or Italian uniforms, often lighter in color and material, were sometimes repurposed, their insignia removed and adapted for American troops. This wasn't widespread, but in specific forward units, it provided a valuable, if temporary, solution. The emphasis shifted from strict uniform adherence to practical utility. The color of their uniforms also became a critical factor. The standard olive drab, while effective for camouflage in temperate zones, absorbed heat voraciously in the bright desert sun. Soldiers began to experiment with ways to lighten their uniforms. Some tried washing their uniforms repeatedly, hoping the color would fade. Others, more daring, used diluted bleach or even local dyes, though these methods were often inconsistent and sometimes damaged the fabric. The ideal solution, light-colored, breathable cotton or linen, was largely unavailable, forcing men to work with what they had. The goal was to minimize heat absorption and maximize evaporative cooling. Hydration, however, remained the most formidable challenge. Water was life in the Sahara, and its scarcity dictated every movement, every strategy. Standard-issue canteens, often made of aluminum, quickly heated their contents to an undrinkable temperature under the blazing sun. To combat this, soldiers began wrapping their canteens in layers of wet canvas, burlap, or even their own socks. As the water evaporated from the outer layer, it would draw heat away from the canteen, keeping the water inside cooler, a rudimentary but effective form of evaporative cooling. But even with cooler water, carrying enough of it was a constant struggle. Each soldier might carry several canteens, adding significant weight to an already heavy pack. Water discipline became paramount. Every drop was rationed, every sip savored. The psychological toll of thirst, combined with the physical exertion, pushed men to their absolute limits. Stories abound of soldiers digging frantically in dry wadis, hoping to find subsurface water or collecting dew from plants in the early morning hours. These were not just acts of desperation, but testaments to an unwavering will to survive and press on. The adaptations extended beyond personal gear to the very vehicles and equipment that were essential for the advance. Jeeps and trucks were fitted with extra water and fuel cans, often custom fabricated or scavenged. Radiators had to be constantly monitored and topped up, often with precious drinking water when nothing else was available. Weapons, particularly rifles and machine guns, needed constant cleaning to prevent sand from fouling their mechanisms. Dust covers were improvised from anything available, old blankets, canvas, even shirts, to protect sensitive moving parts. The desert was a corrosive force, and every piece of equipment required constant vigilance and ingenious solutions to remain operational. These seemingly small individual acts of improvisation collectively formed a formidable adaptive strategy. They were not dictated by high command, but emerged organically from the ranks, from men faced with immediate, life-threatening problems. Each modification, each adaptation, was a tiny victory against the brutal environment. And these victories were not just about personal survival, they were about maintaining the momentum of the advance. Rommel's forces, though seasoned, were themselves battling logistical nightmares and the vastness of the desert. The American ability to adapt, to keep moving when their equipment was failing, was a critical, unsung factor in the race across the Sahara. The objective was clear: cross the vast, inhospitable expanse, flank Rommel, and secure critical positions before the Desert Fox could consolidate his defenses. Every blister, every bout of heat stroke, every broken boot threatened to slow that advance, to give Rommel the precious time he needed. The soldiers understood this implicitly. Their fight wasn't just with the enemy, it was a relentless battle against the very ground they trod, the air they breathed, and the sun that beat down upon them. Their improvised gear wasn't a luxury, it was a weapon, forged in desperation, that allowed them to continue the fight. The relentless march across the Sahara was a test of wills, a grueling gauntlet where every step was a battle against the elements. But what emerged from this crucible was not just survival, but an unexpected strategic advantage. While Rommel's Afrika Korps were formidable and experienced in desert warfare, even they faced immense logistical hurdles and the same unforgiving environment. The key difference, the unwritten chapter of this campaign, lay in the American soldiers' capacity for rapid organic adaptation. Their ability to innovate on the fly, to transform inadequacy into functionality, meant they could sustain their advance where others might have faltered. This wasn't just about individual comfort, it was about operational readiness. A soldier whose feet were crippled by blisters or whose body was racked by heat stroke was a liability. A unit slowed by incapacitated men or failing equipment was a target. By finding ways to mitigate these challenges, even with crude, improvised solutions, the American forces maintained a critical pace. They were not just enduring, they were gaining ground, often covering distances that surprised even their own commanders, let alone the enemy. This sustained mobility was a direct consequence of their battlefield ingenuity, allowing them to outflank and outmaneuver the Desert Fox in a theater where speed and surprise were paramount. The strategic implications were profound. Rommel, known for his swift, decisive movements, relied heavily on his force's ability to traverse the desert. However, his supply lines, stretching back to Europe, were constantly under attack and increasingly tenuous. While his men were well equipped for desert combat, their equipment was designed for a specific mode of warfare, and they too faced the relentless wear and tear of the Sahara. The American forces, by contrast, were learning to thrive on scarcity, to make do with less, and to transform the ordinary into the extraordinary. This adaptability meant they were less reliant on distant supply depots and more capable of independent, sustained operations deep within the desert. Consider the sheer psychological impact of these adaptations. Imagine the morale boost when a soldier, whose feet were raw and bleeding, found relief in a pair of tire-soled boots. Or the renewed determination when a simple headscarf offered protection from a blinding sandstorm, allowing a patrol to continue its mission. These small victories against the environment fostered a deep sense of self-reliance and unit cohesion. They instilled a belief that no challenge was insurmountable, that ingenuity could overcome even the most brutal conditions. This psychological resilience was as vital as any weapon in their arsenal, hardening them for the battles ahead. Sergeant Jenkins often spoke of the collective spirit that improvisation ignited. It wasn't just one guy figuring something out, it was shared. Someone would cobble together a better way to protect their canteen, and suddenly everyone was doing it. It became a competition of ingenuity, a way to keep each other alive. It built a brotherhood, knowing that we were all in this impossible situation together, and we were all finding ways to beat it. This collaborative problem-solving, born of desperate circumstances, created a dynamic, responsive force. The improvised solutions weren't always perfect, but they were often good enough, and critically, they were available now. Waiting for official, purpose-built desert gear was not an option. The timeline for the North African campaign was unforgiving, a race against Rommel's strategic objectives. Every day spent waiting for supplies, every delay caused by equipment failure or heat-related casualties was a day lost. The ability of American soldiers to modify, repair, and invent on the spot meant they could maintain their advance, denying Rommel the time he needed to consolidate his positions or launch counter-offensives. They were constantly moving, a relentless desert tide pushing eastward, surprising the Axis forces with their tenacity and their unexpected endurance. This relentless pace, enabled by their ability to adapt to the Sahara's brutal demands, positioned them to strike at critical points. They weren't just crossing the desert, they were conquering it, turning its vastness from a barrier into an advantage. By traversing routes considered impassable or too arduous by the enemy, they created strategic opportunities that fundamentally altered the course of the North African campaign. Their journey was a testament to the fact that in warfare, sometimes the most powerful weapons are not forged in factories, but improvised in the field, born from necessity and the unyielding will of the fighting man. The daily reality of this advance was a brutal, unforgiving grind. Imagine endless horizons of shimmering heat, the monotonous crunch of sand underfoot, and the ever-present threat of a shimmering mirage disguising a German patrol. The American soldiers, clad in their patched-up uniforms and tire-soled boots, became masters of endurance. Each sunrise brought another 20 or 30 miles of marching, often carrying full packs under a sun that seemed determined to boil them alive. It was during these relentless marches that the efficacy of their improvised gear was truly tested, and often proven. Private Miller, whose feet had once been a constant source of agony, found his tire-soled boots, crude as they were, to be a revelation. They weren't pretty, he admitted, and they squeaked like hell sometimes, but they held together. My feet still ached, sure, but they weren't bleeding. They weren't blistered raw every night. That extra layer of rubber, it made all the difference between collapsing on the trail and being able to put one foot in front of the other for another 10 miles. At Bain, this sentiment was echoed across the ranks. The ability to simply keep moving was a triumph in itself. The adapted clothing also proved its worth, not just against the sun's direct assault, but against the insidious threat of sandstorms. These sudden, violent walls of wind and grit could appear without warning, reducing visibility to zero and scouring exposed skin. The improvised headscarves, fashioned from anything from bedsheets to parachute silk, became indispensable. Wrapped tightly around the face, they offered crucial protection for the eyes, nose, and mouth, allowing patrols to push through conditions that would otherwise have forced them to halt, losing precious time in their race against Rommel. Sergeant Jenkins recalled one particularly brutal sandstorm. It hit us like a freight train. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face, but we had those scarves, those makeshift goggles, and we just kept going. It was slow, agonizing, but we moved. I saw German patrols, later on, hunkered down, waiting it out. That's where we gained ground. That's how we got ahead. This tenacity, fueled by their practical adaptations, directly translated into a tactical advantage. Rommel's forces, while experienced, often relied on established desert routes and predictable movements. The American willingness to push through adverse conditions, enabled by their modified gear, allowed them to take less traveled, more direct paths, catching the enemy off guard. The strategic objective was not merely to traverse the Sahara, but to do so with speed and stealth, positioning themselves to flank Rommel's main forces. This required long-range reconnaissance patrols, often operating far ahead of the main body, deep into enemy-held or contested territory. These patrols, small groups of men reliant entirely on what they could carry and what they could improvise, were the spearhead of the advance. Their ability to remain undetected, to cover vast distances, and to gather critical intelligence depended heavily on their capacity to endure the desert's extremes. Their improvised water cooling systems, often simple wet canvas wraps around canteens, kept their limited water supplies drinkable, a small comfort that made a huge difference to morale and physical endurance during these extended forays. The lightened, breathable uniforms, though far from regulation, prevented heat stroke and allowed them to remain alert and effective when enemy contact was imminent. Every modification, from a crudely reinforced boot to a cleverly draped headscarf, played a part in extending their operational range and their capacity for sustained combat readiness. The very act of survival became a form of psychological warfare. Rommel's intelligence would report American units in locations and at speeds that defied conventional understanding of desert warfare. The Desert Fox himself, a master of swift movements, would have been acutely aware of the logistical challenges posed by the Sahara. The American troops, by overcoming these challenges through sheer will and brilliant improvisation, were effectively writing a new playbook for desert combat, one where the human element, armed with ingenuity, could trump the most formidable natural barriers. Their silent march was a testament to a fighting spirit that refused to be broken, not by the enemy, and certainly not by the desert. The cumulative effect of these seemingly minor, desperate adaptations began to weave a tapestry of tactical advantage. It wasn't just one soldier surviving, it was entire platoons, companies, and eventually divisions, maintaining their operational tempo in conditions that should have brought them to a grinding halt. The tire-soled boots and modified uniforms meant fewer men falling out due to heat exhaustion or debilitating foot injuries. The canteen wraps and improvised headgear meant better hydration and fewer cases of sunstroke. Each small innovation, replicated across thousands of men, transformed a vulnerable, ill-equipped force into a resilient, self-sufficient fighting machine capable of sustained movement through the Sahara's merciless expanse. This collective ingenuity allowed the American forces to achieve something truly remarkable: sustained offensive operations deep within the desert, far from established supply lines. Rommel's Afrika Korps, despite their desert experience, were still largely conventional in their logistical approach, relying on a steady flow of supplies for fuel, water, and replacement parts. While they were masters of desert combat, their movements were often dictated by the need to secure and maintain these vital supply corridors. The Americans, by contrast, were learning to operate with an unprecedented degree of autonomy, making their own resources last longer, adapting their gear to extend its lifespan, and reducing their reliance on what the supply convoys could bring. This flexibility became their secret weapon. Sergeant Jenkins observed this shift firsthand. "We weren't just fighting the Germans, we were fighting the desert itself. And by beating the desert, by figuring out how to keep moving, we were effectively outmaneuvering Rommel before we even saw his tanks. His intelligence would get reports of us being in places they thought impassable, or moving at speeds they didn't account for. That element of surprise, that ghost-like ability to appear where we weren't expected, that came directly from the sweat and brilliance of every private who figured out how to keep his boots on, or his water cool. This capacity for unexpected movement confounded Axis intelligence and disrupted their defensive planning. The strategic gains from this sustained mobility were undeniable. American columns, pushing relentlessly eastward, were able to bypass heavily fortified Axis positions, cutting off retreat routes or appearing on flanks thought to be secure. The very vastness of the Sahara, which Rommel had long used to his advantage, now became a double-edged sword. He expected his adversaries to be bogged down by the environment, to follow predictable paths. But the American soldiers, through their gritty adaptations, defied these expectations. They turned the desert from an impediment into an ally, using its desolate stretches as cover for their audacious flanking maneuvers. Yet, even with these ingenious adaptations, the desert remained a brutal adversary. The heat, though mitigated by lighter clothing and evaporative cooling, still sapped strength. Sand, though kept out of eyes and mouths by scarves, still permeated everything, grinding mechanisms and chafing skin. The psychological toll of the endless, monotonous landscape, combined with the constant threat of enemy contact and the ever-present gnawing of thirst, pushed men to the brink. The adaptations didn't make the Sahara easy. They simply made it possible. They bought the soldiers precious increments of endurance, allowing them to endure one more hour, one more mile, one more day. Private Miller, reflecting on those days, often spoke of the sheer mental fortitude required. You'd wake up and the sun was already a hammer. You knew you had another 30 miles of sand and rock ahead of you. Your feet still hurt, your back ached, and your canteen felt lighter than it should. But you looked at the guy next to you, wearing his patched-up shirt and those tire soles, and you just kept going. It wasn't just the gear. It was knowing everyone else was doing the same impossible thing. That's what kept us moving. This shared hardship and collective resilience forged an unbreakable bond, a powerful unspoken pact to overcome the impossible. The race across the Sahara was reaching its critical phase. Rommel's forces, already stretched, were now facing an enemy that refused to play by the desert's rules. The American advance, fueled by their innovative spirit, was not merely a march, it was a relentless pursuit, designed to deny Rommel any opportunity to regroup or establish a stable defensive line. Each mile gained, each position outflanked, was a direct consequence of the soldiers' ability to defy the Sahara's debilitating effects. Their boots, stitched with scavenged rubber, and their uniforms, cut and re-sewn for survival, were not just symbols of desperation, they were instruments of strategic momentum. This sustained pressure put immense strain on Rommel's already precarious supply lines. His forces, while formidable, were designed for rapid, mechanized warfare, which demanded fuel, ammunition, and provisions in abundance. The American ability to operate effectively with less, to improvise solutions for critical shortages, meant they could sustain their advance longer and further than anticipated. This forced Rommel into a defensive posture, constantly reacting to an enemy whose movements were becoming increasingly unpredictable, an enemy who could seemingly materialize out of the shimmering heat of the desert. The stage was set for a confrontation, but one where the Americans had already gained a vital, unexpected advantage through their sheer force of will and a profound battlefield-born ingenuity. They had mastered the desert, and in doing so, they had begun to master the desert fox. The Americans' ingenuity wasn't just about individual survival. It became a force multiplier, transforming their advance into a relentless surge that defied all conventional expectations of desert warfare. Rommel's intelligence reports began to paint a perplexing picture. American units appearing in sectors considered impassable, or covering ground at speeds that seemed impossible for infantry in the brutal Sahara. This wasn't merely outmaneuvering, it was a fundamental disruption of the enemy's understanding of the battlefield. The Desert Fox, accustomed to dictating the tempo of operations, now found himself reacting to an adversary whose movements were increasingly unpredictable. One instance, recounted by Sergeant Jenkins, involved a critical oasis. We were pushing hard, had been for days, feet aching even in those patched-up boots. Gaman told us Rommel's forward scouts were probably a day ahead, aiming for the same water source. But we had a secret weapon. We could keep moving when their vehicles were bogged down or their men were flagging. Those modified uniforms, the extra ventilation, the scarves, they just let us endure. We hit that oasis before dawn, surprising their advance party. They hadn't expected us for another 12 hours. That water, that position, it was ours because we could outwalk them, outlast them, even when we were supposedly less equipped. This seemingly minor victory, born directly from sustained human endurance, had outsized tactical significance, securing vital resources and denying them to the enemy. The ability to maintain a rapid, sustained pace allowed American forces to exploit gaps in Rommel's defensive lines that would otherwise have closed. They weren't just crossing the desert, they were infiltrating it, using its vastness as a cloak. This constant pressure, this unwavering forward momentum, prevented Rommel from establishing firm defensive positions or consolidating his forces effectively. He was perpetually on the back foot, his strategic planning undermined by an enemy whose logistical limitations he believed should have been far more crippling. Private Miller often reflected on the sheer force of will that accompanied every mile. It wasn't just the boots or the shirts we cut up. It was knowing that because of those little things, we could keep going. Rommel's men were good, no doubt, but they were tied to their supply trucks, their heavy gear. We were lighter, faster, and we knew how to make a little last a long way. That psychological edge, knowing we could push harder, it made all the difference when you hit that wall of exhaustion. This deep-seated belief in their own resilience, fostered by the success of their adaptations, became a powerful, intangible weapon. The relentless pace also had a profound impact on Axis morale. Reports of American units traversing vast, supposedly barren stretches of desert, often without significant vehicle support, began to filter through their ranks. This created an aura of invincibility, a perception that the American soldier was somehow immune to the Sahara's debilitating effects. While far from true, this psychological warfare, an unintended consequence of their ingenuity, served to further disorient and demoralize an enemy already facing stretched supply lines and a determined Allied push from all directions. The adaptations, from the tire-soled boots that protected against scorching sand and jagged rocks to the improvised headgear that shielded against the sun and sandstorms, provided a continuous, incremental advantage. These weren't singular breakthroughs, but 1,000 small battles won against the environment, each one contributing to the larger strategic objective. The cumulative effect was a force that could move faster, endure longer, and operate more independently than Rommel had ever anticipated. This mastery of desert movement allowed American forces to position themselves for decisive engagements, often arriving at critical junctions ahead of schedule or from unexpected directions. They were no longer simply reacting to Rommel. They were dictating the terms of engagement, forcing him to adapt to their aggressive, unconventional tactics. The race across the Sahara was nearing its conclusion, and the American soldiers, through their grit and genius, were poised to claim victory, not just over the desert, but over the legendary Desert Fox himself. Their journey was a testament to the extraordinary power of human ingenuity when pushed to the absolute limits of survival. The American audacity in the desert wasn't merely a series of isolated acts of survival. It was a meticulously orchestrated, if improvisational, campaign to redefine the very parameters of desert warfare. Rommel, the master tactician, had built his reputation on lightning-fast movements and an intuitive understanding of the North African terrain. Yet the American forces, often considered less experienced in desert combat, were now consistently surprising him, operating with a fluidity and resilience that seemed to defy logistical realities. His staff officers, poring over reconnaissance reports, found themselves grappling with a new, unsettling pattern of enemy behavior. They just kept showing up, Lieutenant Schmidt, a fictional German intelligence officer, might have noted in a captured dispatch. One day a sector is clear, the next American patrols are probing our flanks from what we considered impassable wadis. Their infantry, they move like ghosts, sustained by what we do not know. Our aerial reconnaissance shows no major supply lines, yet they persist. This bewilderment within the Axis command was a direct result of the American soldiers' capacity for self-sufficiency and extended operational reach. The tire-soled boots and adapted uniforms meant fewer men incapacitated by the environment, allowing more combat effectives to remain in the fight, pushing forward. This relentless, unconventional advance started to severely compromise Rommel's strategic options. His forces were designed for offensive thrusts, for exploiting weaknesses and driving deep. But now he was forced into a reactive stance, constantly trying to counter an enemy that refused to conform to his expectations. The American ability to traverse harsh terrain quickly, often bypassing known strongpoints, allowed them to threaten critical Axis supply depots and communication lines from unexpected angles. This wasn't just about gaining ground, it was about disrupting the entire Axis operational rhythm. Sergeant Jenkins often spoke of the feeling of being a thorn in Rommel's side. We knew we weren't a big armored column, but we were everywhere. We were the sand in their gears. Every time they thought they had us pinned down or figured out our direction, we'd be somewhere else, or we'd have pushed through a sandstorm they thought would halt us. It was a war of attrition, not just of bullets, but of morale and logistics. And our ability to keep moving, to keep enduring, was winning that war for us. This sustained psychological and tactical pressure slowly but surely eroded the Germans' confidence and organizational cohesion. The success of these adaptations also had a profound impact on American leadership. Initially, there might have been skepticism about letting soldiers deviate so significantly from standard issue. But the undeniable results, fewer casualties from heat and exposure, higher operational tempo, and critical strategic gains, quickly turned skepticism into endorsement. Field commanders began to actively encourage and facilitate these improvisations, recognizing them not as signs of desperation, but as ingenious solutions to unique battlefield challenges. Workshops, often no more than a few men with scavenged materials, sprang up behind the lines, sharing techniques for reinforcing boots, modifying uniforms, and creating better water carriers. Private Miller remembered a period where the ingenuity became almost competitive. Everyone had their own secret sauce for their boots or their head wrap. One guy would use strips of rubber from a blown-out tire, another would find old leather. You'd see men stitching canvas, melting tar, or even using parts of discarded German equipment. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about proving you could outsmart the desert and, by extension, outsmart Rommel. It built a massive sense of pride, a feeling that we weren't just soldiers, we were desert engineers, every last one of us. This grassroots innovation, empowered by necessity, fostered a culture of self-reliance that permeated the ranks. The culmination of this desert mastery was the ability to position American forces for a decisive link-up with other Allied elements, effectively trapping significant portions of Rommel's Afrika Korps. The initial objective of crossing the Sahara ahead of Rommel had evolved into a broader strategy of encirclement, made possible by the sustained, rapid movement of American infantry through terrain thought to be impassable. Rommel's forces, already battling on multiple fronts and facing severe supply shortages, found their last avenues of escape or resupply increasingly cut off. The strategic map, once a predictable canvas of known routes and defensive lines, was being redrawn by the tireless feet of American soldiers. Their path wasn't marked by conventional supply dumps or established airfields, but by the discarded remnants of improvised boots, the faint tracks of patrols, and the enduring spirit of men who refused to be broken. This wasn't just a march, it was a strategic maneuver of epic proportions, executed by ordinary men with extraordinary ingenuity. The Desert Fox, a general renowned for his tactical brilliance and speed, was being outmaneuvered by an enemy who had learned to weaponize endurance and improvisation. The American soldiers, by conquering the Sahara on their own terms, had seized the initiative. They had transformed a seemingly insurmountable natural barrier into a strategic highway, positioning themselves to deliver a crippling blow to the Axis forces in North Africa. The stage was set for the final act of the North African campaign, an act where the ingenuity forged in the crucible of the desert would play a decisive role in securing Allied victory. The ingenuity forged in the crucible of the desert did indeed play a decisive role. The relentless push of American forces, fueled by their tire-soled boots, modified uniforms and unyielding spirit, culminated in the critical link-up with other Allied elements. Rommel's Afrika Korps, already under immense pressure from multiple fronts, found themselves increasingly encircled. The desert, once their sanctuary and their shield, had been transformed into a trap by an enemy who refused to be constrained by its brutal realities. The ability of the American soldier to sustain movement, to operate independently, and to appear where least expected, fundamentally altered the strategic landscape. They had not merely survived the Sahara, they had weaponized its vastness, using it to their advantage against a bewildered and increasingly demoralized foe. The North African campaign reached its inevitable conclusion, a testament to combined Allied efforts, but undeniably propelled forward by the extraordinary resilience and improvisation of the American infantry. Their journey across the Sahara wasn't just a march. It was a strategic masterpiece of human endurance and ingenuity, a race against time, against nature, and against Rommel himself, a race they won through sheer, unadulterated grit and battlefield brilliance. The adaptations born out of necessity evolved into a powerful tactical advantage, proving that even the most formidable environments can be overcome by the indomitable will of the soldier. The saga of these men, transforming scraps into survival gear and determination into momentum, stands as a profound illustration of how ordinary individuals, faced with extraordinary challenges, can achieve legendary feats. This isn't just a tale of survival. It's a masterclass in battlefield improvisation and the indomitable spirit of the American soldier. We delve deep into the personal accounts, the rarely seen photographs, and the strategic implications of these remarkable adaptations. How did these desperate measures, born out of necessity, ultimately contribute to a pivotal victory? What ingenious methods did they devise to protect their feet from blistering sand and jagged rocks when their boots failed? How did they transform their uniforms into functional desert gear, allowing them to endure conditions that would break lesser men? We'll explore the specific techniques, the surprising materials, and the sheer force of will that enabled these men to not only survive the Sahara, but to conquer it, paving the way for the Allied victory in North Africa. Their journey across the Sahara wasn't just a march, it was a race against time, against nature, and against Rommel himself, a race they won through sheer, unadulterated grit and battlefield brilliance. If you're fascinated by the hidden chapters of history, by the extraordinary feats of ordinary men, and by the strategic genius born out of desperation, then you absolutely cannot afford to miss this deep dive into one of World War II's most remarkable, untold stories. Legends of War brings you these meticulously researched, emotionally resonant narratives that illuminate the true cost and incredible triumphs of conflict. We go beyond the headlines, beyond the famous generals, to the very heart of what made these soldiers true legends. To ensure you never miss another epic journey into the annals of military history, to continue uncovering the incredible resilience and ingenuity of those who fought for freedom, hit that subscribe button right now. Join our growing community of history enthusiasts and let us transport you to the front lines of courage and innovation. Subscribe to Legends of War, where every story is a legend waiting to be rediscovered.